Good morning. Today's reading is in Galatians chapter 2, verses 20. My old self has been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. So I live in the earthly body by trusting in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me.
Thank you, Matthew. So this week has been one of those weeks where one event at the beginning of the week just kind of sets it off, and it's just not it's been kind of a difficult week. So many of you probably noticed that Big John isn't here this morning, and you're probably wondering where he is. Well, he came to me. We about once a month I take him out and we go eat somewhere in Clinton, and it's just an opportunity for him to get out of Cordell. And when we were driving back, he told me that he was going to be moving his membership over to another church. And I asked him a lot of questions, and I told him, and I'm not going to tell you his answers because I think that's invading his privacy. I will tell you that I don't think that his reasons were very good. So I'm praying for John, and I hope that you'll pray for John, and I hope that if you see him, just tell him that we miss him. Because I don't think that the church that he's going to is going to take care of him like this church took care of him over the last 11 years. And so it just put a real downer on my week. And this morning, he always comes and gives me a hug during communion. And he gives, I think, Angel and Darcy hugs, and my dad and my daughter. And in some ways, I think John probably, by him doing that, he understands what communion is a little bit better than some of us, because he goes and he gives somebody a hug. That's what communion is about. And so this week was just kind of a downer for me. And like I said, I hope that when you see him, that you'll tell him that we miss him and that we love him, and that he'll come back. Because John is an important part of our church, and we'll miss him a lot. So I hope that you will. So I just wanted to start off and just say that kind of affected my whole week. It really did. I didn't sleep good Monday night, and I was just kind of sad all week. But what we're going to be talking about today is actually kind of goes along with this, because one of the things that John was unwilling to do is sacrifice something. And I'm not going to invade his privacy and tell you what. But he wasn't willing to sacrifice something. And so today we're going to be talking about a really important lesson of walking with God, and that is sacrifice. So we've been talking about this idea of how do we, walking with God. And I want to give you 7 lessons to help you with your walk with God. And so the first week we talked about developing a holy discontent. And remember, that's not a debilitating, shameful discontent. It's actually a freeing discontent. It's the realization that we are paid for. We are in relationship with God. He has a plan for us. And guess what? When we're in this earthly shell, we're never going to fully be there. Right? We're just not going to be. So it's a discontent that comes from that, not feelings of, shame and feeling like, man, I'm just never going to measure up, and so I might as well not even try. No, that's not what holy discontent is. It's a realization that God has a will and a plan for me that I get to spend my whole life trying to figure out. Like, it's pretty cool. And then we talked about being intentional. And, you're not going to walk with God unless you do it on purpose, right? It's got to be an intentional thing. And then a couple weeks ago, we talked about how important it is to immerse ourselves into Christ's culture. Remember, we talked about the 2 different cultures that were present in the first century, right? Either you followed God or you followed, the Greek gods. Like there wasn't a both and. You couldn't do both. You had to do either one. And oftentimes today we think in our American culture that we can kind of serve our Western gods, our Western Trinity, as we talked about, money, comfort, and I don't remember what the other one was. my own points. Anyway, we follow our Western ideas, and we think that we can follow both, right? We can follow that Western trinity of trying to, be comfortable and have money and all the other things that popularity, stuff like that, and we can follow God as well. But what I tried to show you a couple weeks ago is that actually Christ's culture and our Western culture are still mutually exclusive. You can either follow one or the other. So if you missed those lessons, I hope you'll go back and get on our YouTube page or Facebook page and watch those back. Or if you don't remember them, I hope you'll go back and watch them. Because like I said, these 7 lessons that I'm sharing with you are 7 lessons that I've learned in my, I've been a Christian since I was 13. And they're really important lessons to me and things that have meant a lot to me over the years. So there's a little more to these than just a regular old sermon. So before we get into sacrifice, I want to talk a little bit about something that we all experience. So we don't have a choice, okay? So when you're born, you don't have a choice that with the way your body progresses, right? You're going to grow up. Like, it's just going to happen. You can't choose to stay a baby. Like, none of us get to choose that. And so there's these elements of physical growth that we all get to observe and we all get to see in our world. So we see how there is movement forward. So if you're taking notes, don't write any of this down just yet, okay? If you're looking at the little thing inside our bulletin, don't write this down just yet, because I'm leaving something out, okay? So there's movement forward. You grow older, you grow stronger, you progress from first grade to second grade, from junior high to high school, from high school to a trade school, or high school to a job, or high school to college, just depending on which path you're going to take, right? And so it just kind of naturally happens, right? So there's movement forward, and then there is an inward acceptance of identity. So I'm a big sports person. I love sports, and it's always interesting to me how when I observe and watch high school sports, especially, when you're a freshman or 8th grader or whatever, you might make the team. You don't get to play a whole lot. You kind of look up to the upperclassmen. But then as each year progresses and you get bigger and stronger and the seniors graduate, at some point, if growth is working correctly and you have the proper skills and abilities, you will eventually be the upperclassman, and you'll have to accept the responsibility of being that upperclassman and leading those younger kids, right? Of maybe being the team leader, the team captain or whatever. Like, it just kind of happens. And so there's this inward acceptance of identity. And then, as you accept your identity, you renew. There's a renewal. And growth is happening, and you're always going to be changing. You're always going to be becoming a new and different version of yourself. You're never staying. You're always moving forward. You stop making the same mistakes. You become more efficient. You get the same amount of work done with less time, and you become more sure of yourself. Like, I used to spend literally 20 hours a week getting a sermon ready. When I first started preaching. And that's one of the reasons why when Rick Chaplier, some of you know Rick Chaplier, he was an elder at the time. He walked into my house and he's like, "I think you should be the next preacher." And I was like, "No." I was like, "No way, I'm not doing that." Because I wasn't good at preparing sermons. It took me forever. I was always nervous about getting up and preparing. I can get the same amount of work done now in a lot less time. I can usually get a sermon ready in about 6 to 8 hours now. And so I've, more than halved that time. And so there's this renewal. There's a renewal, right? And it's my belief that when it comes to physical growth, you really don't have a choice. Okay, you don't have a choice. I mean, you've seen that movie Failure to Launch. Anybody seen that movie with I think it's Matthew McConaughey and Terry Bradshaw's in it as playing his dad. It's kind of normal, right? You just progress on. Well, he didn't progress on, right? Matthew McConaughey, he's like this grown man living with his parents, and they're like, "We want you to get out of our house. We want you to," it's normal. You just naturally progress. So there's kind of this normal thing unless you have something going on. But the thing about spiritual growth, and honestly, a lot of growth that really matters in our lives, is that we can actually avoid growth easily. It's not natural. Okay, it's not natural. And so that's what we're gonna look for, the missing step here. Okay, so I share with you there's movement forward, there's an inward acceptance of identity, there's a renewal, but there's a missing step that is required if you want to grow in a really transformational way in your life. And I think this applies more than just to spiritual growth. This actually applies to the growth that matters when you get into the real world, right? So you'll see how it applies here in a minute. You're probably like, I don't know what you're talking about. Okay, let's get into it, and I think you'll get it. All right, so let's start reading in Luke chapter 5. This is where Jesus calls his first disciples. All right. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, now Jesus was teaching, there were crowds all around, some fishermen were over there washing his nets, and he wants to get into Simon's boat and push him out into the water so that he can, kind of stand up on the boat and see all the people and preach to them. Okay, so he said to Simon, put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch. And Simon answered, Master, we've worked hard all night, and haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets. Okay, now this is really interesting to me. So I realized one of the things that I hadn't thought about, and I just heard this mentioned this week as I was actually listening to a sermon on this passage, is that the fishermen in this area don't fish in the deep water. They actually fish along the shoreline. So they go along the shoreline, and there's that place where the ledge just kind of comes off, and that's where the fish tend to congregate. You go out into the deep water, the fishermen don't fish out there with their nets. Like, that's silly. They don't do that. And here's this non-fisherman who's given these fishermen instructions. He says, but if you say so, I'll let down the nets. All right. When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. And so they signaled their partners in the boat and the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, go away from me, Lord. Go away from me. I am a sinful man. For he and his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. And so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Then Jesus said to Simon, don't be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people. So you see the progression? Okay, so there's a movement forward. First, they let Jesus in their boat. Okay, that's movement forward. You let Jesus in your boat, and then you listen to him. Go catch some fish in the deep water where there's not normally fish, right? Go out to the deep water, throw your nets in. There's movement forward. And then he says, follow me. And then there's an inward acceptance, right? You're now my followers. You're no longer fishermen. You're no longer a sinful man, right? You're my disciple. You're not defined by your sin. You're defined by your choice to follow me. And then there's this renewal, right? This renewal of now you're not just fishers of fish. You're going to be fishers of men. But there's a really important element that we need to add to our progression. And we see it in verse 11. So they pulled their boats up on shore, left everything, and followed him. Okay, now if you want to take notes, and go ahead and write this down here. So there's movement forward, right? You let Jesus in your boat. You listen to him. There's an inward acceptance of identity. We're now fishers of men. And then there is a sacrifice. There is a sacrifice. They left their boats. They left everything. And they followed Jesus. And that is when renewal happens. There's a sacrifice, and then there's renewal. So sacrifice is important for there to be growth. Now, if you just like reflect on the story of Scripture from God's people, Abraham left his family to go where God called him to go, right? Moses left a comfortable retirement. Okay, I don't know if you realize this, but Moses, when he was called at the burning bush, he was 80 years old. He left a comfortable retirement. He was just sitting out in the desert enjoying his sheep. And then God showed up and said, hey, I have plans for you, Moses. He left a comfortable retirement so he could go and lead the people of Israel out of Egypt. Jeremiah, the prophet, left physical safety. I don't know if you realize this. Jeremiah was a young man, and when he was called by God, he became immediately unsafe because of the message that God had put on his heart. Jeremiah was beaten. He was imprisoned. He actually was led into exile with the other exiles. Like Jeremiah left his physical safety so that he could follow God. He sacrificed. Paul gave up his credentials, right? He was a Pharisee. He was a learned Jewish teacher. And he gave up his credentials so that he could be an apostle or a messenger to the Gentile world, the people who were not Jewish. And really we could go on and on and on, right? But if you think about it, this isn't just a spiritual reality. I mean, think about how growth happens. When humans grow up like they should, there will be certain things that you give up. Like that's just part of growing up. The comfort of your parents taking care of you. Like eventually you're going to have to give that up, right? I still remember the moment when my parents took me to Oklahoma Christian University. I was 18, actually, I was about to turn 19, or I had just turned 19. Yeah, I just turned 19, August 21st, turned 19. And my parents dropped me off at Oklahoma Christian University, and I remember them driving away in our minivan. I can still see our minivan just turning out of the parking lot at OC and then driving away. And I remember thinking, what am I going to do? I don't know anybody. I mean, I had some friends that were upperclassmen, but they weren't here yet. I was here for orientation for freshmen, and I didn't know anybody. You know, I didn't have to give up that comfort zone, right? I could have stayed at home if I wanted to. But when you grow, you just naturally give things up. When I became a preacher, back in 2010, or no, it wasn't 2010, it was 2011 or 12. Anyway, somewhere around in there. And I had been a youth minister for 8 years. I loved those students. I had kids in my youth group from 6th grade all the way through 12th grade. I had learned a lot of the tricks of the trade. I had learned a lot of things about being a youth minister. And I didn't want to give up that comfort, right? But I sacrificed something for growth. And that's just normal, right? That's normal. It's normal to have to let go of things to grow. I love the way the Hebrew writer puts it in Hebrews chapter 12. So in Hebrews 11, he was talking about all these great people of faith, like people who just did amazing things, right? Like talking about Gideon, and he talked about Deborah, and he talked about all the people, Abraham, all the people who had done these amazing things for in faith. And then he says this in Hebrews chapter 12. He says, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, all these people who have done all these amazing things through faith, let us throw off everything that hinders us and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. The Hebrew writer says, throw it off, man. Like, get rid of it. Don't let it hold you back. It makes me think of a story that I heard about 2 paddle boats long time ago. So I don't know I'm not talking about the paddle boats that you sit on and you're chugging with your feet. I'm talking about the old school paddle boats like this. Okay, so these paddle boats were the way that cargo would go up and down the Mississippi River, right? Mississippi River. So I heard a story one time of these 2 paddle boats that were leaving Memphis, Tennessee at the same time, and they were traveling to New Orleans with cargo. And these 2 boats were leaving at the same time, and the crew was kind of like jawing at each other. Well, we're going to get there first. Well, we're going to get there first. We're going to get there first. And that when that starts to happen, it's just a matter of time before it becomes a race, right? Like you get 2 like prideful men as captains, you're gonna get a race. And so these 2 paddle boats start to race. Well, one boat during the race begins to lag behind, and they had plenty of coal for their journey to New Orleans. They did not have plenty of coal for a race. Like when you're running your steam engine at high capacity, it takes a lot more coal. And so eventually one of the sailors is like, well, I wonder if our cargo will burn. And so they start throwing their cargo in there, and they found out, well, this cargo actually burns really good, almost as good as coal. And so they start to throw their cargo into their boat, and they start to win. And of course, their cargo also lightens their boat. And so the boat won because they got rid of their cargo and they lightened their boat at the same time. Sacrifice was the key to victory. Now, was it good for their pocketbook? Probably not. But they won the race, right? And so here's the fourth principle of help to help you in your walk with God. The growth of your walk with God depends upon the level of sacrifice. The growth of your walk with God depends upon your level of sacrifice. I mean, think about it. God sees all of you, all of us, as worthy of His sacrifice, right? He sees all of you as worthy of His sacrifice, and then He calls us to be willing to give up everything to follow Him. Like that's the call. It's not unreasonable, but it's not easy either, right? Like that's hard. Like I don't like that. Like it doesn't come, it's hard to give up things that we're comfortable with, right? It's hard to give up things for something that is intangible. Like I think that's the hardest part, right? Like because He calls you to give things up, but you can't put your finger on where He wants you exactly in your life. But He calls you to give it up. But I think it's important for us to remember that the growth of our walk with God literally depends on your level of sacrifice. Now, for people who are wrestling with it, Jesus says this in Mark chapter 10. He says, "Truly I tell you, no one has left home or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or fields for me and the gospel will fail to receive 100 times as much in this present age, homes, brothers, sisters, mothers, children, and fields, along with persecution, and in the age to come, eternal life." And it's important to remember this. It's important to remember this. Jesus promises to redeem whatever we have lost or given up for His sake or for the gospel. The redeeming begins in the here and now. It's really interesting. And then it culminates in the age to come. Well, how does that redeeming work? You're wondering. Well, I truly believe that when you join the church, and I'm not just talking about just small, like our little church. I just mean the church in general. You gain a whole new family. I mean, that's how it should be. That's how it's supposed to be. And this family watches out for one another. I love watching how this family, this church responds to people when your brothers or sisters are hurting or in need. Like it's a really beautiful thing to see. Now we don't always do it well. I will say that. Sometimes we aren't aware of things, or we forget, or we drop the ball. But I've seen moments where people are in great need, and this church just shows up. I think it was really neat when Angel had his accident. Like, people just showed up, right? Like, a hospital bed ended up in his house. A bar in his shower got installed. Food got brought. Like, it was just really, really cool. Like, that's what happens. When you join the church, you gain a family. It's really powerful. And he says, but guess what? Along with this new family, along with, giving up those people and gaining new people, you're also going to get persecution. Like, Jesus doesn't leave that out. He reminds everybody, you're going to get persecution too. But here's what's really cool. Persecution is a lot easier to suffer when you suffer together. Right? If you've ever gone through a difficult time and you're just alone, like, it's no fun. It's like zero fun, and you have nobody to lean on, nobody to talk to, nobody to pray with, nobody to just embrace you, put their arms around you and love you through it, or people who can't identify. But when you suffer together, there's something really powerful. You can find strength in suffering together and facing persecution together, but ultimately, when everything is going to really be worth it, is in the next stage. Jesus says, in the age to come, you'll receive eternal life. And that's the age when Jesus has returned, when the earth is renewed, when heaven and earth are joined back together. Right now, there's like this barrier between heaven and earth. Heaven, the place where God dwells, and earth, where we join, or where we currently live. But in that age to come, heaven and earth will be joined again. There will be, free going between heaven and earth. It's going to be totally different. You're going to have a new body. I loved my body when I was 18. My body gets frustrating at 41, and I'm sure it gets even more frustrating at 73, right? I mean, at 74, it just gets more frustrating. But ultimately, you're going to experience this incredible renewal in the age to come. And you get to live forever in that space. It's not a space where you're just a baby and like a partially clothed baby playing a harp up in the clouds. Like that's not heaven, okay? Heaven is, being with God is so much more than that. I like to imagine that our new place is going to be a lot like this earth, only without all the junk, all the sin. We're still going to have purpose. We're still going to have things to do. We're still going to have things to enjoy, all that stuff. But we get to do it in that age when heaven and earth have again come together. That's how I imagine it anyway. In Matthew chapter 16, Jesus takes his disciples even deeper. He invites them to give up more than just homes and relatives. In Matthew chapter 16, Jesus says this, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it." See, ultimately, we must sacrifice our own self. This idea of taking up your cross, it really is misunderstood in our current context. People think of taking up their own cross as taking up a burden or taking up, something. Whether it's an addiction or a struggle or whether it's their sin, they think I've got to hold this, I've got to take up this cross and I've got to bear it by myself. No, taking up your cross for Jesus and in that first century has nothing to do with taking up a burden. It has everything to do with being willing to die. Right? Taking up your cross means that you are headed out of the city to be executed. That's what taking up your cross means. It means that you are going outside the city, you're about to face capital punishment, you're about to die. And so when Jesus says take up your cross, he doesn't mean you take up your burden. He means you take up your life and you willingly give it up. That's what it is. We must ultimately sacrifice our own self. See, the growth of your faith depends upon the level of your sacrifice. Did you know that you have a throne in your heart? I don't know if you knew this or not, or if you've ever even thought about it. But the one who sits on this throne in your heart determines your steps, determines your words, and determines your thoughts. So one of my favorite stories is the story of Robin Hood. How many people have watched a movie or two or three or four of Robin Hood? So when I was a kid, I must have watched the Disney version as well as the Kevin Costner version like dozens of times. It's just one of my favorite movies. And this story has been told and retold many, many times. The story of a noble who goes out to fight in the Crusades. And of course, that's a horrible thing. Like the Crusades are an awful thing. But he goes to fight in the Crusades and he comes home to find that Prince John and the Sheriff of Nottingham are now ruling the roost while King Richard is away. Right? And the most important element of the story is the idea of kicking out the Plague King, Prince John, so that there's room for the rightful king to take his place in England, right? That's really the point of the story. And so here's my question for you is who desires to sit on your throne, on the throne that is in your heart? And I would suggest that the person who is constantly trying to sit on the throne of your heart is you. You are the one who is constantly trying to sit on your own throne. Even in the ancient world, when people were following these other deities, right? They created those deities based on their own imagination, right? Came from their imagination, and ultimately it was their creation that was sitting on their throne. Therefore, they were sitting on their throne. They got to dictate how things worked. And this is the reality for you and me. We are the play king. We are the Prince John in our story. And so if we truly want to sacrifice, and walk with God, then we must daily abdicate our throne and make space for the true king. Like, this is what we daily have to do. And I'll just be honest with you. Like, some days I do really well. But then some days, man, I find myself sitting on that throne, just like directing and yada, 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 and doing all this stuff. And it's like, no, we have to daily abdicate our throne so that there is room for the true king to sit on the throne of our hearts. Matthew read this verse just a few moments ago, Galatians 2:20. Paul says it like this. He says, I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Now, it doesn't mean that we jump up on the altar and plunge the knife in, like literally, right? That's not what Paul's talking about. Paul also talks in Romans chapter 12 about being a living sacrifice. But it also doesn't mean that everyone has to go and sell everything and move to the most unchristian place we can find so that we can share Jesus with them. Like, that's also not what it means. Rather, it means that we don't live our life for ourselves. We live it for Jesus. And if Jesus calls you to sell everything and go to the most unchristian place you can find, then you go, right? If Jesus calls you to do that, then you go. But not everybody can do that, right? If everybody did that, there wouldn't be anybody left in churches, There wouldn't be anybody left in your workplace. There wouldn't be anybody left in Cordell, right? We'd all just fly over to somewhere else. That's not it. God calls some people to do that, and he calls others of us to put him on his throne where we are, where we live, in our workplace, where we are. And sometimes it is a literal throwing off. But the meaning isn't about the actual physical thing. It's about ending the power and influence associated with that thing. Sometimes we have to throw off the substance, but sometimes we just have to merely ask, what controls us? How do we make our decisions? Where in your life does Christ not live? I love how in Romans chapter 6, Paul talks about being baptized and meeting the blood of Christ and being immersed into a new culture. But then he says this later on in Romans chapter 6, verse 14. He says, for sin shall no longer be your master, because you are not under law, but under grace. Right? Since none of us is perfect, sometimes we use that as a reason not to deal with our sin. Like, well, we just say that. Well, I'm not perfect. And then we just let our sin hang out in us, right? And it's like, no, that we're called to abdicate our throne, to stop letting our sin control us. Sin is no longer our master. So I want you to ask yourself a question. I want to put this question on the screen, and it's not in your notes. So I don't know if you'll have time to write. Yeah, I think you'll have time to write it down if you want to. But if my hatreds die, or my drive to manipulate dies, if my lusts, my outbursts of rage, drunkenness, gossiping, and indifference to suffering die, and yet I remain, what impact would I have on the people in the world around me? So you can just throw whatever your vice is. I always tell people, everybody has a signature sin. And if you're like me, you have three. Three things that you really struggle with in your life. Like, Everybody has those one or two or three things. We all have them. And what happens in your life if suddenly that thing no longer controls you? What happens? Like, what would be the impact in your family? What would be the impact in your job place? What would be the impact in the relationships that you have out in the community? What would be the impact if suddenly that thing no longer controlled you? What would happen? I believe that in that moment, that is when true growth will happen, right? See, the death of the evil in our lives, it's not a magic thing that changes overnight. It's the gradual result that starts with a holy discontent that begins to be dealt with through intentionality and immersion into Christ's culture, and now sacrifice. We give up, right? We give up. Here recently, I've given up something that was distracting me. I've given up social media. I don't know if you've noticed, but I haven't been on social media, and I haven't been replying to your comments. So if there's things that, why isn't Josh commenting on that? Or why isn't Josh, liking that or whatever? It's because I'm off. I'm just not on. I realized I needed to give it up because it was doing something inside me that I didn't like, that wasn't of God. And so the sacrifice is when growth begins to happen. And Jen asked me just the other day, she's like, "Are you missing Facebook?" And I said, "Not at all. I'm not missing it at all. I'm able to be present I'm so much more. Like, it's this really beautiful thing that I've experienced over the last couple of weeks. It's just been really powerful. And I'm not planning on getting back on until after Easter. And I don't know, by the time Easter rolls around, maybe I'm just going to stay off permanently. I don't know. I don't know. But sometimes we have to give up those things so that true growth can happen. So there's movement forward. There's an inward acceptance of identity. There's a sacrifice. And then when we sacrifice, there is a renewal. And I don't know about you, but I need renewal. Because on my own, I am bitter, I'm insecure, I'm angry, I'm lustful. What do I have to sacrifice? What do I have to sacrifice? Well, I have to sacrifice my desire to be treated fairly, my expectation of perfection. I have to sacrifice my requirement to have my own way. Like, these are things that I've had to sacrifice, and I've had to give it up so that God can truly do inside of me what He wants to do. And I hope that you'll just take some time at this moment to think about, what do I need to sacrifice at this moment so that I can be renewed? One of my favorite scriptures, Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Paul says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is true worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will." You see, God urges all of us to be a living sacrifice. So which parts of you are you unwilling to put on the altar? Which parts of you are you holding back? Who is sitting on the throne of your heart? We're going to sing a song called "Reign in Me." And I want you to sing along even if you can't say this with full confidence. But I hope that this will be your prayer, that Christ will reign in you. And just think about who is reigning in your heart on a daily, hourly basis. And I hope that this song can be your prayer this morning. So let's stand, let's sing together.